When allies are treated like bargaining chips and tariffs become the language of power, the global trade order isn't just shaking, it's rewriting the rules. On July 10, 2025, President Donald Trump announced a 35% tariff on all imports from Canada and 25% on Japan, with no negotiations, no legal framework. Each decision was signed through a unilateral letter with a crucial clause. Tariffs would change depending on the relationship with each country. In a world where trust once served as the foundation of alliances, countries are now facing a hard question. When trust is replaced by coercion, how much longer should they stay? A new game from an old pen. No agreements needed. No Congress. Just a letter. In the summer of 2025, global trade is being reshaped not by marathon negotiations in Geneva or multi-layered G7 summits, but by a string of unilateral documents from Washington, letters signed by President Donald J. Trump, each ending with a chilling refrain. I, Donald Trump, have the right to change this tariff at any time, depending on our relationship with that country. In the history of U.S. trade policy, never has a single administrative document carried such weight. No congressional approval, no public consultation cycles, no need to consider supply chains or labor markets, all condensed into one absolute personal authority. If the Reagan era used trade to spread democratic influence and Clinton used globalization as a growth engine, then Trump in 2025 has fully shifted into a new form of power, trade as an instrument of impulsive punishment. What's striking is not that Trump changed the rules, but that he erased them. Decades spent building bilateral and multilateral frameworks, from NAFTA to the WTO, from GATT to the TPP, operated on a foundation of trust in rules, in fair treatment, in predictability. But in Trump's world, trade is no longer law. It's leverage, a highly flexible, hyper-personalized tool operating more like a series of emotional reactions than a national strategy. That's why the imposition of a sweeping 35% tariff on Canada, one of the U.S.'s most stable and loyal partners for over a century, without warning was not a technical shock. It was a declaration of war on the old order, and a clear signal that alliance no longer protects anyone from becoming an economic target. What unsettles nations now is not the size of the tariff, but the unpredictability. Because if tariffs are no longer based on trade deficits or industrial imbalance, but simply on relationships, then no country can know if it will wake up as the next victim. Even more troubling is the way these letters are being used to shape foreign policy. When Trump tied a 50% tariff on Brazil to the country's treatment of former President Bolsonaro, he officially dismantled the line between trade policy and political retaliation. A country is no longer punished for trade violations, but for displeasing the personal preferences of the U.S. president. This is no longer the realm of economics. This is the domain of personalized power. To Trump, the letter is not paper and ink. It's performance. And in performative politics, surprise is the ultimate weapon. A midnight tariff announcement, a handwritten note photographed and posted on Truth Social. This is no longer policy procedure. It's a message to the world that America is willing to go it alone, and, if necessary, to tear down the old stage and build a new one with its own rules. From inside the U.S., this policy creates a feeling of temporary control. It allows the president to redraw the trade map like a general sketching a battlefield, pushing countries into defensive positions, forcing them to come to the negotiating table, not with dossiers, but with pledges of loyalty. But globally, it creates the opposite reaction. When trust is pulled from the system, nations don't choose to cooperate. They choose to exit, not out of hostility, but out of survival. And it's already happening. Not just in Canada, where Prime Minister Mark Carney chose silence over confrontation, but in Japan, Europe, and dozens of other economies. All understand one thing: if the rules can shift with emotion, then the only way to survive is to stop depending. Every letter Trump sends, seemingly just economic pressure, is in fact an invitation to walk away from a trade system built by America itself. And the world is starting to walk. Not because they want to leave America, but because they can no longer stay in a system where rules are replaced by mood. When allies learn to walk without looking back. In a world once built on strong, stable ties, Canada and Japan were two anchor points in America's structure of power: steadfast, loyal, and willing to sacrifice for the common good. But by the summer of 2025, they no longer held that position. Not because they turned away, but because the bridge between trust and strategy had been dismantled by Washington itself. The 35% tariff on all Canadian goods and 25% on Japan were not just economic blows. They were warnings about the real status America now assigns its allies. No longer strategic partners, no longer friends sharing regional burdens, but names on a list subject to change depending on the relationship. That downgrade forced both Ottawa and Tokyo to ask a difficult question. If the alliance is no longer a shield, is it still worth holding on? The answer came not through defiant declarations, but through quiet, decisive actions. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't call a press conference or publicly protest. Instead, he let his diplomats quietly accelerate an FTA with ASEAN, expand LNG exports to Malaysia, and continue logistics agreements with Petronas. Within just a few short weeks, Canada not only reshaped its trade map, but also redefined its role in the Indo-Pacific region. In Tokyo, the response came faster and more forcefully. The Japanese government called the U.S. measures coercion by tariff and pledged to protect domestic industries. But despite the strong language, their actions reflected a longer-term strategy, not confrontation, but quiet withdrawal. Japan re-established security ties with Canada, strengthened links with Indonesia and Vietnam, and deepened negotiations with Europe on high-tech cooperation, where no clause is tied to a leader's mood. The common thread in both responses was speed of adaptation. No panic, no threats of retaliation, just a series of carefully calculated steps to reduce dependency on the U.S., not to end the alliance, but to preserve survival in a world where ally can become pawn at any time. But this isn't an escape. This is a proactive rebalancing. In Canada's new strategy, Asia is no longer a Plan B, but a growth center. Redirecting LNG flows to non-U.S. partners is not just trade. It's a way to minimize geopolitical risk, protect cash flow, and strengthen its position as an energy supplier. When Ottawa signed an intelligence-sharing agreement with Tokyo, it wasn't just about security. It was a message that Canada is choosing new partners in the global game. For Japan, the message runs deeper. For years, Tokyo has invested in reducing reliance on China, but 2025 is the year it extends that effort to include the United States. As tech and defense deals with Europe and ASEAN grow, Japan isn't building walls, it's building a bridge to a world where no superpower holds the reins alone. And to do that, they're willing to pause, reassess, and rebuild from the ground up. From a wider perspective, the responses of Canada and Japan reflect an unspoken fear among global strategists. If the U.S. can no longer be trusted, who takes its place? No one wants to answer that question, but the moves being made suggest countries are preparing for the day they'll have to. When alliances become liabilities, independence becomes survival. Trump once boasted that his tariff policies forced countries to come back to the table. But what's unfolding tells a different story. Allies aren't loudly turning away. They're quietly finding other paths. No breakups, no explosions, just a silent decoupling that Washington may not even notice until it's too late. And that is the greatest risk. Not from rebellion, but from the wisdom of allies who once understood America, and now understand that they must walk forward on their own. When tariffs become political declarations. On July 9, 2025, a single sentence appeared on Truth Social. No national flag, no presidential seal, just a letter signed Donald J. Trump. But its shockwaves rippled instantly through embassies, trade offices, and financial markets. The message was simple: a 50% tariff on all goods from Brazil, effective August 1st. No negotiation, no prior notice, no room for discussion afterward, just a command. And with that, Brazil, the largest economy in South America, one of America's top trade partners in the region, became the next victim of a policy that no longer hides its true intent: political punishment. Because behind that letter was more than trade. Trump publicly stated that the tariff decision stemmed from how the Brazilian government handled former President Jair Bolsonaro, his political ally in the global populist movement. He called Bolsonaro's prosecution unjust, a witch hunt, and thus turned an entirely internal Brazilian issue into the basis for a brutal economic strike. This was no longer about trade balance. This was a personal power statement in the language of tariffs. What's frightening isn't just that Brazil was hit with tariffs, but that a precedent has been set. Any nation that displeases the U.S. president personally can be punished without any economic justification. The international trade order, once maintained through legal norms, bilateral agreements, and systemic restraint, has now been replaced by politicized emotion. For Brazil, this blow isn't merely fiscal. It's an attack on national standing. Brazilian agricultural exports, from beef and coffee to soybeans, which make up a major share of shipments to the U.S., were suddenly thrown into uncertainty. The country's financial markets trembled. The real dropped nearly 4% in just 48 hours after the announcement. Multinational corporations with supply chains in Brazil began signaling plans to pull out. No one asked why anymore. They just asked, who's next? For the rest of the world, the tariff on Brazil wasn't just a strike. It was a warning. If an economy nearing $2 trillion in size like Brazil can be punished simply for political disagreement, then what will protect smaller nations? If a domestic judicial decision can be labeled unfriendly and converted into a trade barrier, where is the line between sovereignty and submission? The answer, clearly, has been erased. More importantly, the action against Brazil revealed a new essence of U.S. trade policy under Trump. Tariffs are no longer tools of economic adjustment, but have become blunt force diplomatic weapons. They're used not to balance flows of money, but to intimidate, to display dominance, to redraw the relationship map based on loyalty. And this puts allies, partners, and even rivals in a bind. React and risk becoming the next target. Stay silent and accept the new rules of the game. Countries like Germany, India, South Korea, all currently negotiating separate agreements with the U.S., must now weigh not just trade terms, but political tone. In a system where economic decisions are emotionally charged, every country can become a hostage. In the past, U.S. presidents used foreign policy to shape the world, but always kept trade at a safe distance from personal power. That's why the WTO, FTAs, and arbitration mechanisms once mattered. But when those principles are cast aside, everything becomes unpredictable. A single tweet or letter can overturn an entire nation's strategy before breakfast. Trump understands this, and he's using it like a blade, displaying strength through the very chaos he creates. The problem is, in that performance, other nations are no longer spectators. They're targets, and they're beginning to respond not by confronting him, but by building a new order that no longer revolves around the United States. In this new world, Brazil is not alone. It is merely the first chapter in a book being written in the language once reserved for the Cold War. Punishment, deterrence, control, and loyalty. But the context is no longer ideology. It's self-interest. And what suffers most isn't GDP or trade balance. It's the world's trust in America as a global guide. The race against the clock and the power of silence. In a summer where letters from the White House have become trade verdicts, the world has entered a state of emergency it wasn't prepared for. On July 9, 2025, Brazil was hit with a 50% tariff as a political warning. One day later, Europe and Canada woke up under the shadow of economic ultimatums. No more free negotiation. No more multilateral roundtables. What remained was a countdown clock and messages from Washington delivered without any room for bargaining. But what's worth noting is not just who was warned, but how they were warned differently. Europe was given a deadline of July 31st to finalize the deal, while Canada only had until the 21st. Ottawa's timeline was shorter, and the conditions were also different. After Canada lifted its digital services tax at the end of June to show goodwill, the White House didn't respond with de-escalation, but with a cold message. Thanks, but not enough. Instead of reopening public negotiations, the Trump administration chose to separate Canada from the group talks, handle it individually, shorten the timeline, and increase pressure intentionally. With Europe, everything still carried the tone of diplomacy. Technical meetings between ministers, press releases from Brussels, cautiously optimistic words about positive progress. But for Canada, the atmosphere was a long, deliberate silence. No statements from Prime Minister Mark Carney, no joint communiques, no internal leaks, no images of the negotiating team, just a formidable quiet. And that silence is what started to draw the world's attention. Because Carney didn't choose the usual path of modern diplomacy, where media plays the role of bilateral pressure. He chose to stay hidden at a time when every other country was rushing to sign a deal to escape. While the EU was finalizing every clause with Washington, Canada, the country threatened with a sweeping 35% tariff, moved at its own rhythm. No panic, no theatrics, as if time pressure itself was a tool that Ottawa deliberately left for Washington to use alone. That contrast in response is no accident. It reflects a deeper difference in Canada's position. This is not an economy clinging to access the U.S. market. This is a country staring straight at a new reality. If alliance only exists through submission, then it's better to change the model of relations than to lose negotiating sovereignty. In closed-door rooms in Brussels, European policymakers still hope to negotiate a way to preserve export flows, especially in pharmaceuticals, auto parts, and high-tech. But for Canada, Carney's silence isn't delay. It's strategy, not getting pulled into the media whirlpool, not giving the U.S. a platform to amplify pressure, not letting Trump's clock become their own. And so, the paradox happened. The more the Trump administration talked about approaching deadlines, the more they fell into the trap created by Canada's silence. A trap that didn't need to be set, just waited for. Because the closer July 21st comes without word from Ottawa, the more markets worry. American businesses, especially in agriculture, autos, and raw materials, began pressing Washington in reverse. Some governors of states bordering Canada even issued warnings about immediate damage if trade flows are disrupted. And in the middle of it all, Carney has still said nothing. In this chess game, Canada isn't just moving slowly. Canada is deliberately controlling the tempo. And that has reversed the roles. Instead of being the country squeezed by a deadline, Ottawa is now making the White House feel short on time. No country wants to be Brazil, a sudden target, punished instantly without recourse. But Canada also doesn't want to be the EU, forced to sign fast, sign under pressure, and continue living under the shadow of the next threat. Between those two extremes, Carney is quietly crafting a new model of dialogue with a superpower. Not defiance, not submission, but standing still so the other has to step forward. And when the countdown clock strikes its final chime, people will have to ask again, whose side was time really on? A strategy that doesn't resist, but never yields. While Washington amplified the ticking of the clock, while Europe stepped on the gas to reach the negotiation finish line before the deadline, Canada, with only a few days left until the July 21st deadline, still showed no clear sign of concession. No press conferences from the Prime Minister's office, no leaked documents from the negotiating team, no media-savvy statements like those from Brussels or Tokyo. Just silence. But behind that silence lies a sophisticated strategy operating with the precision of a central bank, true to the nature of Mark Carney. Coming from his former roles as Governor of the Bank of England and head of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney is not a conventional politician. He is a man of markets, of reaction chains, of logic and data. And when he stepped into politics as Prime Minister, he brought with him a unique style of confrontation, not by direct conflict, but by using systemic structure to neutralize pressure. At the Calgary Stampede, the traditional Alberta festival, where voters often favor bold leadership, Carney didn't appear as a prime minister cornered by crisis. He stepped up with a message not about trade, but about rebuilding the nation from within. He spoke about housing, clean energy, next-generation manufacturing, and long-term resilience. He didn't avoid the U.S. issue, but he didn't make it the centerpiece either. It was a subtle pivot, showing that Canada no longer sees itself as a wounded, dependent nation, but as an economy learning to reclaim its own role. Because Carney understands one thing well, Trump wants one thing only: a victory that can be broadcast on television. A quick, spectacular deal, ribbon-cutting ready on a campaign stage. And precisely because he knows that, Carney doesn't resist by rebutting. He resists by refusing to give Trump a stage. No hasty signing, no joint table, no statements like, "We were forced." Carney turned his absence from the media into a discreet yet deeply political counterstrike. Instead of responding point by point to Washington's demands, Carney shifted the game by offering a strategic message. Canada isn't here to plead for concessions. Canada is here to offer value. In closed-door meetings, Canadian negotiators didn't just repeat numbers on steel, aluminum, or agriculture. They spoke about supply chain security, the China threat, cross-border labor commitments, and shared interests in a transparent trade system. They didn't negotiate to escape. They negotiated to restructure. That's how Canada delivered the message. We are not challengers to American power. We are a responsible extension of it, if you're willing to look beyond this morning's headlines. What's noteworthy is that this strategy has started to generate positive effects in the markets. Canada's TSX and the U.S.'s S&P 500 both hit new highs in the first week of July. According to Bloomberg, investor confidence wasn't based on the expectation of an immediate deal, but on trust in the stability and thoughtfulness of Canada's approach, especially after Ottawa quietly removed the digital services tax, a move that had previously angered Washington. The financial world appreciated Carney's prioritization of flexibility to open the door to dialogue. But behind it all remains a standoff. Trump needs a victory statement as soon as possible. Carney needs to preserve long-term structural interests, even if it means going against short-term market expectations. Each side has its own pressure. But the difference lies here. Trump is forced to perform, while Carney has the freedom to choose his timing. and in an era where political messaging often comes as fireworks on Twitter or Truth Social. A strategy that is quiet, non-confrontational, and unyielding becomes the most enduring form of resistance. Silence, in the hands of someone who understands how markets react, is no longer weakness. It is a deliberate message, a strategy to remind the world. The one who shouts the loudest does not necessarily control the game. When silence becomes the strongest counterstrike. From Washington, the pressure keeps pounding like war drums. Finalize the deal now. July 21st is the deadline. If not, tariffs will automatically increase. That's the familiar rhythm of Donald Trump's trade strategy. Force the opponent to react in order to control the narrative. But strangely, this time the one being cornered isn't reacting as expected. Canada, instead of striking back, simply stands still. And it is that stillness that is causing the axis of the game to tilt. It's becoming increasingly clear. Trump doesn't just want a deal. He wants a performance. In the political model he's built, victory lies not in the content of the agreement, but in the timing of its announcement and the handshake in front of cameras. For Trump, success needs an image, needs a soundtrack, and above all, needs to happen before the other side can tell their own story. But Carney is doing the opposite. He's not following the U.S. script. He doesn't deny the pressure, but he doesn't give it an easy exit either. He lets time pass as if it were Canada's ally, not a ticking bomb set by the White House. While observers predict Carney will speak out in the coming days, in reality, he says nothing. And each hour that passes without a response from Ottawa causes Trump to lose a bit more control. The prolonged pressure turns into a self-inflicted wound. Businesses on both sides of the border are getting anxious, not just because there's no deal yet, but because Canada's silence is making the worst-case scenarios possible. In industrial states like Michigan and Ohio, where exports to Canada are an economic lifeline, manufacturing associations have started lobbying Washington in reverse. If Canada doesn't give in, and the U.S. truly imposes a 35% tariff on all goods, the result will be American workers losing jobs first, said an internal memo from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This puts Trump in a dilemma. If he backs down, he loses the image of a tough leader. If he follows through, he cuts into America's own supply chains, right in the middle of election season. And this is exactly the moment Carney has anticipated. The moment when the one applying pressure must face the pressure they themselves created. It's not the first time Trump has used the push hard, win fast tactic, but never has an opponent fully refused to play by his tempo like Canada is doing now. No arguments, no requests for more time, no blame shifting. Just the quiet presence of a strategy that knows. The more silent it is, the more the other side is forced to speak and expose its own weaknesses. Financial markets have responded. At first, they expected Canada to take a step back, like Europe. But when the second week of July passed with no signs of concession, investors began to realize Ottawa didn't come to dodge, it came to rewrite the game. The TSX began to fluctuate, not due to instability, but because early assumptions were shattered. Meanwhile, political analysts saw something deeper. Carney was proving he wasn't the one being forced to sign. He was the one forcing Trump to choose between symbolic victory and real cost. And that choice is growing harder by the day. As each day passes without Canada giving in, Trump finds it more difficult to back off without losing face. But at the same time, if he goes through with the 35% tariffs, he will face backlash not just from Ottawa, but from American voters, American producers, and even members of the Republican Party. Because tariff policy, no matter how it's framed in the language of sovereignty, can't escape the consequences of economic reality. If every decision must be wrapped in a personal letter, then every cost will bear the name of the one who wrote it. And this is the turning point Carney is waiting for. He doesn't need to win on the media front. He doesn't need to shift the trade balance. He just needs to let the other side sink deeper into the game they created themselves. A game with no easy exit, where every next step must pay the price, in credibility or in growth. Silence, in the end, is not a lack of options. It is the option that forces the opponent to act first. And when that happens, the one who controls the game is not the one who talks the most, but the one who understands that silence, at the right moment, can make the whole world listen. When the answer doesn't come from words, but from who stays and who moves on. July 21st is approaching, and no one really knows what will happen. Outside the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa, journalists are stationed, international news agencies are buzzing with coverage, and investors are holding their breath. From Washington, the threats continue to echo. If Canada doesn't sign, tariffs will automatically apply. But within that whirlwind, something is gradually taking shape. Not the end of a negotiation, but the birth of a new era, where trust is no longer the default currency in relationships between allies. Trump is not alone in using trade as a tool of pressure, but he is the first to transform tariff policy into a personal declaration of power. With unrelenting speed and intensity, in just 3 short months, he announced he would complete 90 deals in 90 days. But the world saw no 90 agreements. Only 90 days of uncertainty, threats, and letters without solutions. From Tokyo to Brussels, from Ottawa to Brasilia, nations are realizing one common truth. If the rules of the game are no longer stable, then no future can be built on a foundation of unpredictability. Countries that once relied on the U.S. as a cornerstone in their long-term strategies are now finding new paths, not out of hostility, but out of survival. Canada and Japan are prime examples of this shift. Both were once trusted allies, standing side by side with the U.S. during critical moments of the post-World War II international order. But now, they no longer wait for instructions from Washington to determine their strategic position. They haven't cut ties, haven't closed embassies, haven't withdrawn from security commitments, but they're no longer placing their future in the hands of someone who can rewrite every commitment with a single social media post. And this is the foundational difference. No nation has declared itself breaking away from the U.S., but no nation is building its development plans anymore under the assumption that America will always be the stable pillar. What's unfolding is not an anti-American movement, but the quiet birth of a post-American world, where the U.S. still exists, still matters, but no longer holds the uncontested central role. At the heart of this change is something no one wants to admit. When tariffs replace trust, relationships can no longer stand still. Canada hasn't declared opposition to the U.S. They've simply signed an FTA with ASEAN, expanded energy cooperation with Asia, and signed an intelligence sharing agreement with Japan. Japan hasn't issued public protest either, but no longer waits for the U.S. to lead in regional initiatives. The EU is still at the negotiation table, but at the same time, they're accelerating talks with Mercosur, Africa, and the FTA bloc. All of them understand single-line dependence is dangerous, and that is not the result of a revolution, but the inevitable outcome when the pillar of trust is removed from the architecture of international relations. For Canada, the July 21st deadline is no longer a trap. It becomes a measure to see who truly needs this deal more. Washington wants a victory statement. Ottawa wants a sustainable model. And when the two sides define success differently, delay is not failure. It is a strategic declaration. In a game where Trump sets the rules, Canada has chosen not to play by the script. And that act, though without grand rhetoric, sends a clear message. In an era of impulsive decisions, resolve is one of the few remaining weapons. No one knows exactly what will happen after the 21st. But one thing is certain: when the dust settles, the world will not return to how it was. Because the Allies, once seen as satellites orbiting a single center of power, have now learned to recalibrate their own trajectories. They no longer wait. They move on. And that very act of moving on is the most profound answer to a world that is shifting course.